In the heart of World War II, far from the ruined cities of Europe and the storm-lashed seas of the Atlantic, another battlefield stretched across a land unlike any other. North Africa's 700-mile expanse, from Benghazi on the Libyan coast to Alexandria in Egypt, became the stage for one of the most unforgiving campaigns of the entire conflict. For more than 2 years, armies clashed here under a blazing sun, their battles shaped as much by the desert itself as by strategy, weapons, or courage. This was no ordinary front. The North African desert was a land of extremes where temperatures soared by day and plummeted at night, where water was more valuable than gold, and where endless dunes concealed hidden mines ready to claim the lives of the unwary. Soldiers who arrived here often found the enemy less terrifying than the landscape itself. Sandstorms could erase entire encampments overnight, while scorpions, snakes, and swarms of flies turned daily survival into a battle long before the first tank fired its gun. Into this harsh environment marched the great powers of the era. Mussolini's Italy, eager to expand its African empire, saw Egypt and the Suez Canal as prizes that would secure its place among empires of old. Britain, already stretched thin across the globe, understood that holding Egypt meant protecting its lifeline to India and the wider empire. And soon, Adolf Hitler dispatched one of his most daring generals, Erwin Rommel, whose lightning-fast tactics would carve his name into history as the Desert Fox. But this was more than a clash of leaders and armies. The Desert Campaign was a story of endurance, improvisation, and the will to fight in conditions no textbook of military science had ever fully prepared men for. It was a test of supply lines as much as firepower, of grit as much as technology. Victory here did not only depend on tanks or planes, it depended on who could master the desert's cruel demands. As the campaign unfolded, reputations were built and broken. Italian forces, once boasting of easy conquest, crumbled against smaller but determined British units. Rommel's daring blitzkrieg swept across hundreds of miles, shocking the world. Malta, a small island fortress, became the pivot of the Mediterranean, disrupting Axis supply lines and proving that tiny points on the map could shape the fate of empires. And ultimately, in the sands near a small railway halt called Alamein, a battle would be fought that Churchill himself declared the turning point of the war. In this story, we will walk step by step through the North African campaign, not only the battles, but the daily lives of the men who endured the desert, the strategies that faltered or triumphed, and the lessons still remembered today. This is a tale of heat, hardship, and heroism, where every grain of sand seemed to carry the weight of history. If you enjoy uncovering these hidden stories of World War II, stories of courage, strategy, and survival, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter of history brought to life. Together, let us explore the deserts where the fate of nations once burned beneath the relentless sun. When Mussolini gave the order to launch his grand campaign in North Africa, he imagined a swift and glorious advance that would bring Egypt under his control and strengthen Italy's standing on the world stage. He placed his faith in Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, commander of more than 200,000 Italian troops stationed in Libya, who was tasked with crossing into Egypt and striking a decisive blow against British positions. The plan, at least on paper, appeared formidable. The Italians had numbers on their side, a massive force that dwarfed the contingent of British and Commonwealth soldiers holding the desert frontier. For Mussolini, this was meant to be not only a military maneuver, but also a statement of power, one that would show the world Italy could stand as a modern empire alongside Germany. Yet what unfolded would prove to be very different from his expectations, and the harsh desert would soon reveal the limits of both preparation and ambition. As Graziani's army began its advance, they pushed slowly across the barren sands, capturing key points but failing to achieve the kind of momentum Mussolini had hoped for. The desert was unforgiving, stretching endlessly under the scorching sun, and the supply lines that fed this massive Italian force were long and fragile. Water, fuel, and ammunition had to travel great distances to keep the offensive alive, and any disruption threatened to bring the advance to a halt. The British, though far fewer in number, understood this reality well. Their commander, General Archibald Wavell, had fewer than 40,000 men at his disposal, but he possessed a sharper sense of strategy, mobility, and the advantages of intelligence gathered in the field. Rather than meet the Italian force head-on in static battle, Wavell prepared to exploit every weakness. British and Commonwealth units, including troops from Australia, India, and New Zealand, were trained to fight with speed and coordination. Armored divisions in particular became crucial, using the vast desert plains not as obstacles but as opportunities for maneuver. When the Italians established fortified camps, hoping to secure their hold on captured territory, Wavell saw opening. He ordered daring strikes, sending smaller but highly mobile forces to hit supply convoys, outflank enemy camp, and exploit gaps in Italian defenses. The difference in morale between the two sides was striking. Many of Graziani's soldiers, poorly equipped and often uncertain of why they were fighting in the first place, soon faced an enemy that seemed always to appear from unexpected directions. British forces, though stretched thin, carried with them a sense of purpose, bolstered by their ability to turn disadvantage into opportunity. Their coordinated use of tanks, artillery, and aircraft magnified the impact of every maneuver. In late 1940, Wavell launched Operation Compass, a limited offensive intended only to disrupt Italian positions. What followed was a stunning reversal of fortune. In just a matter of weeks, the Italians who had entered Egypt with hopes of rapid victory found themselves retreating in disarray. Entire divisions surrendered, overwhelmed not by superior numbers but by relentless strikes from smaller, more agile British forces. The myth of Mussolini's unstoppable army collapsed under the desert sun, replaced by scenes of columns of prisoners marching into captivity. By early 1941, Wavell's men had captured tens of thousands of Italian soldiers and advanced deep into Libya, seizing control of strategic towns and ports. This remarkable turnaround shocked observers across the world. Mussolini's gamble had not only failed but exposed Italy's military weaknesses on a global stage. The North African campaign, once envisioned as a showcase of fascist strength, had become instead a story of humiliation and lost opportunity. Yet in the broader scope of the war, this was only the beginning. While the British celebrated their unexpected victories, the struggle for the desert was far from over. Soon, Germany would intervene, sending its own forces under Erwin Rommel to restore the Axis position and to turn North Africa into one of the most fiercely contested battlegrounds of the entire conflict. The clash between Mussolini's overconfidence and Wavell's tactical brilliance set the tone for what the campaign in North Africa would truly represent. A test not only of armies but of endurance, ingenuity, and the ability to adapt in one of the harshest environments on Earth. It was a campaign defined not by sheer numbers, but by how effectively those numbers could be used. And in that respect, the early stages of the war in the desert revealed a lesson that would echo throughout the years of fighting that followed. The stunning reversal of fortunes in North Africa soon became one of the most talked about episodes of the war. For it was not merely a military engagement, but a shift in morale that reverberated across continents. When British forces launched their daring counteroffensive, the desert so often silent, unyielding, and treacherous suddenly came alive with the sound of armored vehicles surging forward, and troops pressing the attack with resolve sharpened by weeks of hardship. Tobruk, The vital port city that had been seen as an anchor for Italian ambitions fell into British hands after a carefully executed maneuver that caught the defenders off guard. The capture was not a small achievement. It meant more than just possession of a port. Tobruk was a lifeline for supplies, a strategic point that dictated control of the Libyan coast, and its fall signaled that Mussolini's dream of swift dominance in North Africa was unraveling faster than anyone in Rome could have imagined. From Tobruk, momentum carried forward into Benghazi, where the struggle intensified but ultimately gave way to yet another British victory. Thousands of Italian soldiers, who had entered the desert with confidence under the banner of conquest, found themselves surrounded, cut off, and forced to surrender in droves. The image of long lines of weary prisoners being escorted away through the sand became symbolic of how drastically the tide had turned. What had begun as an invasion of Egypt with over 200,000 troops ended with vast numbers of those same men becoming captives. Their weapons discarded, their uniforms dusty and torn, their faces etched with disbelief. To the British soldiers, this was proof that discipline, planning, and resilience could triumph over sheer numbers. And for the wider world watching, it was a story of hope during a time when victories elsewhere seemed scarce. The desert, however, was more than just a backdrop to the fighting. It shaped the very course of the campaign. The distances were immense, stretching hundreds of miles between outposts and settlements, and every advance demanded precise coordination of fuel, food, and ammunition. British forces managed to achieve the near impossible by turning logistical difficulties into an advantage, striking where their opponents least expected and maintaining pressure before Italian forces could regroup. The speed of their armored divisions was decisive, overwhelming defenses before commanders had time to react. In Benghazi, the rapid fall of the city sent shockwaves through Italian command structures, forcing them to confront a reality that none had anticipated: that their army, meant to be the spearhead of Mussolini's imperial vision, was instead on the verge of collapse. For the soldiers on the ground, these victories were not just abstract lines on a map, but lived experiences carved into memory. The sight of Tobruk's harbor, once fortified against them, now flying the Union Jack, brought an immense surge of pride. The capture of Benghazi, with its warehouses and docks, meant that supplies could flow more steadily, giving them the strength to carry on in the face of the desert's unrelenting hardships. And yet, amid the celebrations, there was also a recognition that this was not the end. The campaign stretched onward, and though Italian forces had been humiliated, whispers had already begun of a new adversary who might soon arrive to challenge them, one whose reputation for tactical brilliance would make the coming chapters even more dramatic. Still, in those early months, the triumphs at Tobruk and Benghazi stood as testaments to what could be accomplished against the odds. They energized a war effort that desperately needed good news and reminded all who followed the conflict that courage, ingenuity, and determination could alter the course of history, even in the most unforgiving landscapes on earth. When 1941 unfolded, the sands of North Africa were no longer quiet. Into this unforgiving desert arrived General Erwin Rommel, a figure whose reputation had already begun to precede him across Europe. With the arrival of the Afrika Korps, the theater of war between Benghazi and Alexandria took on a new and dangerous dimension. The Italians had faltered, their early attempts undone by a far smaller but determined British force. Yet Rommel's presence shifted the balance almost overnight. His style of command was bold, almost audacious, a style that earned him both admiration and fear. He believed in speed, surprise, and relentless pressure, principles that came to life through the blitzkrieg tactics he unleashed in the desert. Within 12 astonishing days, British forces, who had only recently been celebrating hard-won victories at Tobruk and Benghazi, found themselves retreating across 500 miles of barren terrain, pursued by the ferocity of Rommel's armored divisions. The desert, with its endless expanses of sand and the searing heat by day and bitter cold by night, seemed an unlikely stage for such a swift and dynamic campaign. Yet Rommel turned its very harshness into an advantage. He moved with agility, confusing his adversaries, striking where they least expected, and never allowing them time to regroup. The British, exhausted and straining under the pressure of maintaining extended supply lines, suddenly faced the unnerving reality of an opponent who seemed unstoppable. Tanks churned up the desert, convoys kicked up dust clouds that obscured vision, and every sunrise brought with it the possibility of another rapid advance that pushed the line farther and farther away from the safety of Alexandria. For soldiers on the ground, it was a whirlwind. British troops, accustomed to being on the offensive after the collapse of Italian positions, now faced the bitter taste of retreat. It was not merely the loss of territory that weighed on them, but the sudden reversal of momentum. The realization that they were up against a commander whose instincts allowed him to anticipate their movements and counter them with ruthless precision. In war, perception is as powerful as reality, and Rommel's reputation grew larger with every mile the British fell back. Stories of his tactical brilliance spread like wildfire, elevating him in the eyes of his men and unnerving his opponents, giving the sense that the Desert Fox, as he would soon be known, was always one step ahead. Yet, the desert was not a forgiving ally. Behind every rapid strike lay a precarious web of logistics. The Afrika Korps depended on supplies funneled across the Mediterranean, vulnerable to British naval power, and every advance stretched their resources thin. While Rommel's genius lay in daring maneuvers, he was also gambling against time and terrain. His armored thrusts achieved dazzling results, but they also dragged his forces deeper into hostile territory, where every gallon of fuel and every crate of ammunition became critical. Still, in those first weeks, it seemed as if nothing could slow his relentless push. The psychological toll on the British was immense. Having entered the campaign confident after their string of victories, they now found themselves fighting to hold the line, their commanders forced to reassess strategies that had seemed solid only months before. Rommel's ability to turn defense into offense, to transform the desert into a canvas for his sweeping maneuvers, was unlike anything they had encountered. Each town or outpost became a stepping stone in his larger plan, and with each victory, he deepened the sense that North Africa was no longer a secondary front but a crucial battlefield where the fate of the Mediterranean might be decided. In those 12 days, the map of North Africa was redrawn in the most dramatic fashion. It was not simply about land gained or lost, but about the shifting tide of momentum, the collapse of British confidence, and the emergence of Rommel as one of the most formidable commanders of the war. His arrival marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Desert Campaign, one that promised even greater clashes to come. The sands that had witnessed Italian defeat now bore testimony to German resurgence, setting the stage for a struggle that would stretch across years. Testing endurance, strategy, and the willpower of every soldier who marched across that harsh and unforgiving land. Malta, a small island fortress in the Mediterranean, became a thorn in the side of Axis ambitions and a silent but decisive participant in the Desert War. Though tiny compared to the vast North African battlefields, its position made it a natural sentinel astride the sea lanes, and from its airfields and harbours British forces struck relentlessly at Axis convoys bound for Libya. Every ship that left Italy loaded with fuel, ammunition, and food for Rommel's Afrika Korps had to run the gauntlet past Malta's aircraft and submarines, and many never made it through. For Rommel, whose daring offensives relied on speed, surprise, and the unbroken momentum of supply, the losses were crippling. Victories in battle could only carry him so far when tanks ran out of fuel in the open desert and men went hungry under the blazing sun. At first, the Axis command underestimated the island's significance, believing that the strength of their land forces and the ferocity of their air raids would compensate. Yet time and again, British bombers swooped from Malta's skies to scatter convoys, while submarines lurking offshore picked off vulnerable cargo ships. The more Rommel pushed into Egypt, the longer his supply lines stretched, and the harder it became to keep his soldiers provisioned. Fuel, the lifeblood of his swift-moving formations, became scarce, and without it the fearsome armored spearheads ground to a halt. Ammunition deliveries faltered, leaving German and Italian gunners rationing their shells. Even food supplies dwindled, forcing soldiers to subsist on meager rations that sapped their strength during the grueling desert campaigns. For the men on the ground, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Tanks and trucks, once symbols of German mobility, stood idle for lack of fuel. Rommel's ability to maneuver and outflank the British, the very essence of blitzkrieg, became constrained. Commanders planned offensives only to cancel them when the necessary supplies failed to arrive. Soldiers faced the disheartening reality that even the greatest battlefield triumphs could collapse in the face of empty fuel cans and half-empty supply trucks. Malta had become more than a nuisance. It was the fulcrum upon which the North African War turned. The British, fully aware of the island's importance, endured months of merciless bombing by Axis air forces. Valletta, the capital, was reduced to rubble in places, and yet the defenders refused to yield. Pilots of the Royal Air Force flew from battered runways to intercept enemy aircraft, while convoys of their own fought through the Mediterranean to keep Malta supplied. For the people of the island, survival itself became a daily battle, yet their endurance proved invaluable to the Allied cause. Each convoy that the Axis lost to Malta's defenders was a silent victory that rippled across the desert battlefields hundreds of miles away. Rommel himself recognized the challenge and pressed his superiors for an invasion of Malta, but the Axis leadership hesitated, torn between the demands of the Eastern Front, the defense of Europe, and the North African theater. Their indecision allowed Malta to remain in British hands, and the longer it endured, the greater the strain on Rommel's army. By the summer of 1941 and into 1942, his soldiers found themselves increasingly at the mercy of supply shortages, even as they pressed forward against British positions. The Afrika Korps became a paradox, feared for its skill and daring in battle, yet perpetually weakened by a fragile logistical chain that Malta severed again and again. This imbalance gradually tilted the war's momentum. While Rommel's tactics inspired awe and dread, his brilliance was undermined by the reality that wars are not won by maneuver alone. They are won by sustaining armies, feeding them, fueling them, and equipping them for the long struggle. Malta's defiance ensured that Axis armies in North Africa would never enjoy secure lines of supply, no matter how many victories they claimed on the battlefield. The island became the unsung hero of the Mediterranean, a fortress whose endurance undermined Rommel's advances and gave the British the breathing space they needed to regroup, reinforce, and prepare for the battles yet to come. In this way, Malta's role, though small in size, became monumental in impact. It was the unseen hand that shaped the Desert War, proving that strategy and geography could be as decisive as tanks and guns. For every mile Rommel gained in the sands of Libya and Egypt, Malta quietly stole the resources that might have made those gains permanent, ensuring that the Axis tide would eventually recede. It was a reminder that even in the grand sweep of history, a single island and the courage of its defenders could change the fate of continents. Life in the Desert War was not defined only by gunfire and advancing lines of tanks, but also by the unforgiving landscape that seemed determined to test every soldier who set foot upon it. Sandstorms could rise out of nowhere, swallowing entire convoys in walls of dust that blotted out the sun and reduced visibility to almost nothing. Men would choke on the fine grains, their weapons and vehicles clogging with sand that seemed to creep into every crevice, making even the simplest task a battle against the elements. When the wind finally died down, it left behind dunes reshaped by nature, erasing familiar tracks and confusing navigation, forcing soldiers to rely on instinct and discipline to keep moving forward. The blazing heat by day baked the ground until it shimmered like liquid, while nights dropped into bitter cold that seeped through thin uniforms, leaving men shivering after hours of sweating under the desert sun. Flies swarmed relentlessly around food, water, and wounds, driving soldiers to frustration as they tried in vain to keep the pests away. Snakes slithered through camps at night, and scorpions, well hidden under rocks or boots, could deliver venomous stings that left men incapacitated when every available hand was needed for survival. In such an environment, the desert itself became an enemy as formidable as any army. Yet amid this daily struggle, necessity sparked ingenuity. One of the most vital inventions to come out of the desert campaigns was the jerrycan, a simple but revolutionary container designed to carry fuel and water more efficiently than the flimsy cans used before. Its sturdy shape, easy handling, and reliable seal meant that armies could transport life-sustaining resources across vast stretches of barren land, reducing the risk of waste and loss in conditions where every drop mattered. Equally crucial was the development and use of mine detectors. Mines had been scattered across the desert in huge numbers, creating deadly traps invisible to the naked eye. Traditional methods of clearing them relied on probing the sand with bayonets or simply sacrificing men and vehicles to chance. The arrival of mine detectors transformed this grim reality, giving soldiers a way to uncover hidden dangers before they claimed lives, and allowing armored divisions to advance with greater confidence through minefields that had once seemed impenetrable. These innovations, born out of desperation, were more than just tools. They represented the ability of human ingenuity to adapt to circumstances that seemed insurmountable. In the great sweep of strategy and shifting battle lines, they were quiet victories that gave soldiers a measure of control against both man and nature. The desert campaign was not won or lost in a single battle, nor was it fought solely by generals drawing arrows across maps. It was carried on the backs of ordinary soldiers who faced endless hardships, who kept machinery running in a world of dust and heat, who endured thirst, fear, and exhaustion, and who found ways to improvise when standard supplies and procedures failed. Their survival was as much a testament to adaptability as it was to courage, and their story cannot be told without recognizing the unrelenting presence of the desert itself. The North African front became a proving ground not just for tactics, but for resilience. Every sandstorm, every scorching day, and every bitterly cold night shaped the character of the men who fought there. They learned that wars are not only decided by the clash of armies, but by the ability to endure and overcome nature's obstacles. In that, the Desert War was a crucible, forging innovations and resilience that would echo far beyond its boundaries. It showed that even in the harshest environments, where the land seemed determined to resist human presence, determination and creativity could carve out a path to survival and, ultimately, to victory. The shifting tides of leadership within the British Eighth Army became one of the most defining features of the North African campaign. A reminder that wars are never fought by soldiers alone, but also by the minds that guide them from behind maps and strategy tables. When General Archibald Wavell first commanded the theatre, he was burdened with the impossible task of balancing limited resources, political expectations from London, and the relentless push of Axis forces led by Rommel. Wavell was not without brilliance. His earlier victories in Operation Compass had been decisive and had shaken Italian positions across the desert. Yet, The arrival of Rommel and the Afrika Korps transformed the battlefield into a new contest of speed, deception, and endurance, and Wavell's measured caution soon drew criticism from Churchill, who demanded a more aggressive posture against the advancing Axis threat. The strain of having to stretch his forces across vast distances, with reinforcements always arriving too slowly, meant Wavell was often fighting with one hand tied behind his back, and eventually he was recalled, a casualty not of the battlefield but of the political arena. His successor, Claude Auchinleck, inherited both the challenges of desert warfare and the immense political pressure that came with it. Unlike Wavell, Auchinleck was more flexible in his approach and had a deeper appreciation for the unique difficulties posed by North Africa, where distances were vast, supply lines fragile, and the environment itself seemed determined to punish any miscalculation. He reorganized the Eighth Army, shoring up morale and attempting to instill a sense of resilience in troops who had faced repeated retreats. At one point, Auchinleck personally took command in the field during the First Battle of El Alamein, halting Rommel's advance toward the Nile and Cairo. His calm, deliberate leadership was effective, but it lacked the fiery, aggressive image Churchill craved to inspire both Parliament and the British public. In the shadow of politics, Auchinleck too would eventually be replaced, his contributions overshadowed by the narrative of needing a bold new leader. That new figure came in the form of Bernard Montgomery, a man whose very presence seemed to electrify the Eighth Army. Montgomery understood not only the art of war, but also the psychology of soldiers and the importance of appearance in sustaining morale. He arrived with confidence, reshaped the army's organization, and instilled a fresh sense of purpose that had been eroded by years of retreat and uncertainty. Unlike his predecessors, Montgomery refused to be rushed into premature offensives. He took the time to build his defenses, secure his supply lines, and prepare his men for a confrontation that he insisted must be decisive. His attention to detail, his insistence on preparation, and his ability to communicate clearly with his troops turned him into more than a commander. He became a symbol of determination, someone who convinced wary soldiers that victory was not only possible, but inevitable if discipline and patience were maintained. Under Montgomery's leadership, the Eighth Army transformed from a battered force into one capable of delivering the decisive blow at the Second Battle of El Alamein. The careful buildup of men, tanks, and supplies created a moment where the balance shifted, and the desert, which had long seemed to favor Rommel's audacious maneuvers, now offered the stage for British resurgence. The victory at El Alamein was more than a battlefield triumph, it was a turning point in morale, not just for the soldiers who fought there, but for the entire Allied world watching from afar. Churchill himself would later declare that before El Alamein the Allies had never had a victory, and after it, they would never suffer another major defeat. That statement, though simplified, captured the essence of what Montgomery and the Eighth Army achieved, a transformation of despair into hope, of retreat into advance. The succession of commanders Wavell, Auchinleck, and Montgomery illustrates how the story of North Africa was never solely about tanks clashing on sand dunes or supply lines stretching across endless deserts, but also about the human element of leadership, vision, and the constant interplay between politics and strategy. Each man brought different strengths, bore different burdens, and faced unique criticisms, but together they embodied the reality that victory in war often depends as much on resilience in leadership as on courage in combat. Their journeys, marked by setbacks, perseverance, and eventual triumph, remain central to understanding how the Allies turned the tide in North Africa and ultimately set the stage for future victories across the Mediterranean and beyond. The fall of Tobruk in 1942 marked one of the most dramatic turning points in the Desert War, A moment that not only reshaped the military balance in North Africa, but also reverberated through the halls of power in London, Berlin, and Washington. The fortress town, perched on the Libyan coast, had become a symbol of resistance for the Allies after its stubborn defense in 1941. Its garrison had withstood siege after siege, holding out against Rommel's determined assaults, and its resilience had offered hope during some of the darkest days. But in June of 1942, the tide shifted. With a lightning offensive, Rommel's Afrika Korps stormed the defenses, and within a day, Tobruk collapsed. It was a devastating blow to Allied morale and a triumph that Hitler eagerly seized for propaganda, showcasing it as proof of Axis superiority in the Desert Campaign. The fall shocked Britain. Winston Churchill himself admitted that it was one of the darkest moments of the war, second only to the fall of Singapore earlier that same year. The defeat at Tobruk carried consequences beyond the battlefield. Thousands of prisoners were taken, vast supplies fell into Axis hands, and Rommel's reputation as the Desert Fox soared to legendary heights. He had not only crushed a fortified stronghold, but had done so with such speed that it rattled the confidence of Allied leaders who had believed Tobruk could withstand another long siege. The victory emboldened Hitler, who promoted Rommel to Field Marshal, making him the youngest officer in the German army to reach that rank. For the Axis, it was a surge of momentum. For the Allies, it was a jarring reminder of how precarious their position in North Africa truly was. The loss underscored the logistical challenges, leadership struggles, and political pressures that had dogged the British command since the beginning of the Desert War, and it revealed how quickly fortunes could change under the desert sun. In London, the fall of Tobruk triggered immediate political repercussions. The British public, already wary from years of war and news of setbacks across multiple fronts, struggled to comprehend how such a vital fortress had been lost in a single blow. Churchill faced severe criticism, both from Parliament and from his own government, as questions arose over strategy, command decisions, and the adequacy of supplies. The United States, newly committed to the war effort after Pearl Harbor, also paid close attention, aware that the loss could jeopardize future plans for joint Allied operations. For the soldiers who had fought and endured within Tobruk's walls, the surrender was more than a tactical loss. It was a heartbreak, a collapse of a position they had once believed unshakable. Stories of men forced into captivity, separated from comrades and sent into the uncertainty of prison camps, added a human dimension to the military failure that no amount of official statements could soften. Yet even amid despair, the fall of Tobruk carried within it the seeds of resilience. For Rommel, the victory created new risks as well as triumphs. His army, stretched thin across the desert, had to maintain its momentum, pushing deeper into Egypt in pursuit of Cairo and the Suez Canal. The farther he advanced, the longer his supply lines became, and the more vulnerable he was to the very shortages that Malta and Allied air power had long inflicted. For the British, Tobruk's fall forced a reckoning. It spurred changes in leadership, eventually elevating Bernard Montgomery to command the Eighth Army, a decision that would transform the Desert War in the months ahead. The humiliation of Tobruk could not be erased, but it fueled a determination to regroup, rearm, and return with renewed strength. As the Desert Campaign unfolded, the memory of Tobruk lingered. It stood as a reminder of the fragility of confidence, of how victories and defeats were not just about territory but about symbols, morale, and the stories nations told themselves in times of war. For the Axis, Tobruk was a glittering prize, paraded in newspapers and speeches as proof of inevitable success. For the Allies, it was a wound, painful yet instructive, shaping decisions and strategies that would ultimately lead to redemption at El Alamein. The fall of Tobruk was not the end of the Desert War, but rather the beginning of its most decisive chapter. a chapter in which the lessons of defeat would lay the groundwork for eventual triumph. In the vast theatre of North Africa, where sand and steel collided under a pitiless sun, Tobruk's fate was both a warning and a turning point, one that underscored the unforgiving nature of war in the desert and the resilience required to endure it. When Montgomery assumed command of the Eighth Army, the Desert War had reached a tipping point, and the men under him were tired, scattered, and disheartened after months of setbacks. Yet within that exhaustion lay a determination that only needed direction to become strength. Montgomery wasted no time in reshaping both strategy and spirit, instilling discipline, organization, and above all, confidence, because he knew that in a struggle as brutal as the North African campaign, victory would come not only from firepower but also from belief. Training was intensified, units were drilled relentlessly, and every soldier was made to feel that he was part of a grand plan that was carefully thought out and achievable. A vision far different from the desperate improvisations of the past. Equipment and supply lines were reorganized, new tanks and artillery were allocated more effectively, and the troops were reminded that they were no longer a battered force on the run but an army that could meet Rommel's reputation head-on. This renewal was not merely about weapons and tactics. It was about restoring morale and creating a unified force where confidence in leadership replaced doubt, where discipline steadied nerves, and where hope began to outweigh fear. As the preparations unfolded, the vast desert itself seemed to anticipate the coming confrontation, a stage of endless sands that had already witnessed years of shifting fortunes. But now it would host a battle that would change the course of the war. Montgomery studied the terrain meticulously, choosing Alamein as the ground upon which to confront the Axis, because here the narrow strip of land between the sea and the Qattara Depression offered no room for sweeping flanking maneuvers, forcing Rommel to meet the British head-on. When the offensive finally began in October 1942, it was not the reckless gamble of a desperate commander, but a calculated strike executed with precision, combining overwhelming firepower with coordinated infantry and armored advances. The desert night lit up with artillery barrages that shattered Axis defenses, and the thunder of advancing tanks carried with it the determination of men who had once doubted themselves but now pressed forward with renewed purpose. Rommel's forces, formidable as they had been, found themselves worn down, their supply lines strained, their confidence shaken by the relentless push of an army that no longer looked back to its defeats, but forward to its destiny. The battle raged with intensity, marked by grinding attrition and fierce resistance. Yet slowly, inexorably, the momentum shifted. What had once seemed impossible, the breaking of Rommel's line, was now unfolding before the eyes of men who had endured years of hardship under the desert sun. When the Axis finally began to retreat, it was not merely a tactical withdrawal, but the unraveling of their entire North African campaign. For the Eighth Army, victory at Alamein was more than just a battlefield success. It was the restoration of faith in themselves, the vindication of sacrifice, and a turning point that resonated far beyond the desert sands. News of the triumph spread quickly across the world, lifting Allied morale at a time when hope had often been scarce, and giving proof that perseverance, discipline, and leadership could overcome even the most daunting of opponents. In the quiet after the battle, as the desert winds swept across fields where so many had fought, the soldiers of the Eighth Army understood that they had been part of something historic, a moment when the tide turned and when despair gave way to determination, and determination gave way to victory. Alamein was not the end of the war, but it was the beginning of a shift that would carry through to ultimate triumph, a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, under the most unforgiving conditions, courage and unity could change the course of history. As the desert winds finally quieted and the battles of North Africa faded into history, The legacy of this campaign became far larger than sand, tanks, and battle lines. It was a struggle that revealed the harsh truth of modern warfare. Victory depended not only on bravery in the field but also on the unseen lifelines of supply, the coordination of strategy, and the resilience of leadership under immense pressure. The war in North Africa demonstrated how fuel, food, and equipment could prove as decisive as any artillery barrage, teaching future generations of commanders that battles are often won or lost far from the front lines. At the same time, this campaign forged enduring legends. Rommel, the so-called Desert Fox, gained a reputation for tactical brilliance, admired even by his opponents, while Montgomery emerged as a symbol of British determination and calculated resolve. Yet these myths, while captivating, often simplified the reality of a brutal, grinding contest where countless ordinary soldiers endured extremes of heat, thirst, and fatigue, their sacrifices forming the foundation upon which reputations were built. It was their endurance, as much as the strategies of generals, that turned the tide of war. Alamein, in particular, marked more than just a battlefield victory. It symbolized a turning point. For the first time, the forces of Hitler's Germany were decisively halted and pushed back, proving that the Axis war machine was not invincible. From that moment, momentum shifted, and with it, a sense of hope spread across the Allied nations. North Africa became the prelude to new campaigns in Sicily, Italy, and eventually the liberation of Western Europe. Without the desert battles, the story of the Second World War would have taken a very different course. As we reflect on this chapter, it reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. It also calls on us to remember the lessons hidden beneath the dramatic headlines of victory and defeat. Leadership, preparation, and unity mattered, but so did the perseverance of individuals who often went unnamed in the history books. The Desert Campaign reminds us that history is never only about generals and speeches, it is about people. Enduring hardship, holding on to hope, and finding the strength to continue when the outcome seemed uncertain. Thank you for staying with me through this journey into the Desert War of North Africa. If you found this story meaningful and would like to continue exploring history together, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who enjoy uncovering the past. Your support means everything and helps keep these stories alive. Until we meet again for the next journey through time, I wish you peace, rest, and a good night's sleep.